Sure.
Mhm.
Okay, great. Thank you. Once again, I'm Dugan Becker. I'm with SouthCoast Wind, and with SouthCoast, I am a community liaison. So that basically means it's my job to talk to anyone and everyone in the public about what offshore wind is, what SouthCoast Wind is looking to. Basically, I get yelled at a lot. I answer a lot of questions, and I try to collect feedback to help kind of shape what our offshore wind project looks like. We're obviously just one of quite a few going on right now. So today I'm talking about industry.
Mute yourself in, turn off your sound.
Turn off your microphone. Oh, okay, sorry.
Cool. I'm going to be talking about the industry as a whole rather than SouthCoast Wind, which is kind of a mix-up for me. But that being said, I'll answer any and all questions to the best of my ability. That being said, before I dive in, I know for a fact I have way too many slides for the amount of time that I have today. So I'm going to be moving kind of quickly. Try your best to keep up, but if not, I'm more than happy to take any and all questions either afterwards or even after the meeting today. So basically, I was asked by Carrie to come here today to talk a little bit about the headwinds that are facing offshore wind currently. So as Jeff mentioned, I gave kind of a 101 presentation the last time I was here. This time is going to be a little bit more doom and gloom. But really what I'm trying to get at is most of you have probably seen a lot of scary headlines recently about what's going on with offshore wind. And there's honestly a lot of confusion kind of going around about like, how serious are these challenges that we're facing? And like, is there anything that can be done or is it all doomed? So I'm trying to shed a little bit of light on that. And just to better inform you all and to honestly give you some hope, because spoiler alert, things really aren't as bad as they seem. There are workable paths forward. Yeah, cool. So, yep. Today, basically, I'm just going to give a super high level overview about the U.S. offshore wind landscape currently, kind of what's going on, what our goals are. I'll touch on economic headwinds, permitting headwinds, and then the cost of inaction if we don't kind of get our ducks in a row, as well as some reasons for hope. And again, there really are quite a few reasons for hope, but before I give you those, I'm gonna worry you a little bit. Cool. So first things first, why do we even care about offshore wind? It is hands down one of the most robust renewable resources that we have at our disposal, point blank. So it really is a core of our nation's climate plan, many of our states' climate plans. Quite simply put, it's just hard to find other renewable resources that are as accessible within the United States, right? So the U.S. has some of the strongest offshore wind speeds in the world, especially here in New England, as you can see from this map of wind speeds. And if you could harness just 1% of the offshore wind resources that we have in this country, you could power the entirety of New England, right? So it's a super robust resource. And on top of that, a massive percentage of the U.S. population, I want to say like 40% of the U.S. population lives within coastal communities. So they live within communities that are, can tap right into these resources right off the shores. It's just a matter of actually doing it. That being said, our current administration has really kind of recognized that power and recognized the value of this resource and has set some pretty ambitious climate goals around offshore wind accordingly. Like I said, it really is kind of the cornerstone of a lot of our climate plans as a country. So Biden recently, or not too recently at this point, a couple of years ago, established a goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030. So to put that in perspective, that's about 10 million homes powered with offshore wind energy. And we're making pretty good progress to actually meeting that goal. Right now, there are 50 gigawatts of offshore wind in development. So, some are farther down the line than others, but essentially the wheels are turning on 50 gigawatts more than what the national goal is. So this is really probably the biggest push on renewable energy that we've ever seen in this country and maybe ever will see. So it's really promising stuff. There are 32 different offshore wind lease areas in the United States right now on both coasts. A lot of states really actively driving this, really pushing towards implementing as much offshore wind as they can. So things, as Jeff mentioned, things were looking pretty good for a while there, right? And then maybe that's a little bit of foreshadowing about what's been going on recently. But this is just to kind of demonstrate the scale of what's at hand and really kind of the potential of what we're looking at with offshore wind. Jeff also asked me if I could zoom in a little bit on the southern New England region. So obviously there's a lot going on across the country, but these 10 projects here are really what you're most likely to hear about here in New England. So these 10 projects alone represent about 13,000 megawatts or 13 gigawatts. And to put that in perspective, ISO New England, the regional grid operator for all of New England, just today, I believe, when I checked their website, said they had about 19 gigawatts of all generation capacity available right now. So adding 13 gigawatts of renewable energy is a massive increase, not just in terms of available energy, but in terms of available renewable energy. So really, again, I mean, the potential that we're looking at off our coast right here is pretty substantial. You might hear about any one of these given projects. Revolution Wind is the one that has a contract with the state of Rhode Island currently, but there's a pretty good chance that these other projects might in the future have contracts with Rhode Island. Rhode Island has a RFP for offshore wind out right now for an additional like 1,200 megawatts, I want to say. So any one of these projects more or less could supply Rhode Island with energy as well. At the end of the day, the entire New England region shares a single grid, so it really doesn't matter where it plugs in as long as it's in New England. And even if it's not, it's still good for climate, right? But this is kind of the local landscape. Along those lines, I won't spend too much time here, but even though Revolution Wind is the only state currently with a contract with the state of Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island has jurisdiction over almost every single one of those projects. I won't go into details on this because it's kind of complicated, but more than happy to expand on it afterwards. But essentially, Rhode Island is in kind of a unique position where most coastal states have jurisdiction for 3 miles from the coastline. Rhode Island has jurisdiction over this entire area, which is kind of unique to them. And it means they're really involved in the permitting processes of, like I said, pretty much every one of these projects going on off the coast right now in some way or the other. The Coastal Resource Management Council is the regulatory body in Rhode Island that really holds this power, but there are a couple other regulatory bodies at play as well that I'll talk about a little bit later. So, like I said, offshore wind was looking pretty good. We had the gears moving, things things turning along. And then the last couple of years happened, and there were quite a few economic challenges in the last couple of years, like the war in Ukraine, COVID-19, supply chain shortages, inflation, interest rates, you name it. Economic challenges that really impacted the global economic climate. None of these things are specific to offshore wind by any means, but they certainly are still stressors that impact offshore wind, right? So thinking about offshore wind in particular, what do these challenges really look like in actuality? Can we get a little bit more detailed? I pulled this quote from a recent Department of Energy report. Bear with me, I really try not to read off the slides, but this one sentence summarizes the situation pretty succinctly. So it says, inflation of commodity prices, global supply chain shortages, high interest rates from central banks, and uncertainty of wind turbine availability. You can swap that out with just resources, materials availability, have substantially increased project costs over the past year, specifically for projects with planned commercial operation dates of between 2025 and 2028. So commercial operation date means the day that you're actually delivering power to the grid, right? It's the day these projects go online. For those projects, these challenges are threatening the viability of some projects with offtake agreements negotiated before the cost increases began, right? So the first half of this sentence, pretty straightforward, pretty much everything we just talked about. You got inflation, you got supply chain challenges, you name it. These are economic stressors that we're all feeling, pretty much everyone in this room. The bottom half of that sentence is where things get a little bit more interesting. So to provide a little bit more context here on the message they're trying to get across, this is a super simplified version of an offshore wind development timeline, right? So from left to right, left is, the federal government gave you a lease area. They said, hey, if you can get all your permits, you can build a project here. From there, you move into the permitting and design phase. So the permitting and design phase is essentially you're surveying the area, figuring out what the seafloor looks like. You're doing all your initial engineering design. So how many turbines? What kind of turbines? Where are they going? How are we bringing it to shore? What kind of cables? All that good stuff. And then you're using that design to apply for permits, federal, state, and local. Most importantly, for the conversation that we're having right now, the other thing that happens during this phase is these projects seek out power purchase agreements or offtake agreements. And essentially what that is a deal between a project, right? So SouthCoast Wind, for example, it is a contract that says SouthCoast Wind agrees to sell the state of Rhode Island or Rhode Island Energy this much power for this price, right? So 1 megawatt for X price. And that price is calculated through a really complicated, really kind of comprehensive math problem that takes into account the entire economic climate at the time, right? So what are steel prices? What do turbines cost? You know, how much do we expect to spend on workforce? How much do we expect to spend on vessels? And what are the reasonably foreseeable economic risks that we might encounter? Keywords: reasonably foreseeable economic risks. So that being said, you boil that all together, you get a price, and that's the price that you have a contract for with the state. In the next phase, the following phase, pre-construction, is when you actually start spending money as a company, right? So that's when you're actually buying these turbines, when you're actually buying cables, actually signing workforce agreements. So the point I'm trying to make here is, like, when you establish a power purchase agreement, a PPA, you are essentially dictating what the project's revenue is going to be for the lifetime of the project. It is a single contract that spells out every single penny that project will ever make, because there's no way to, the only way these projects make money is by selling energy, point blank. So you're locking in your revenue at the permitting and design phase, and then in the next phase, you know, a couple of years later perhaps, is when you're actually spending money to get the project built. So why that matters, if you take a look at this global inflation chart, right? So this is 2013 to 2021, pretty stable, pretty predictable, nothing crazy going on. This period here between 2018 and 2021 is when most of the offshore wind contracts in the United States were awarded. So again, these power purchase agreements were established at a time where the economic climate was pretty stable. And that's when revenue was locked in, you know, based on assumptions of what turbines cost during that time, and, you know, what workforce cost during that time. And then 2021 happened, or 2022 happened, right? So global inflation doubled. Interest rates followed a pretty similar trajectory. Commodity prices followed a pretty similar trajectory. So essentially, revenue was locked in a very different economic environment where things were pretty stable, and nobody saw COVID-19, nobody saw the war in Ukraine, nobody saw these other global economic challenges coming, and the actual costs that these projects are incurring are now being incurred at a much higher rate. So essentially, the economics just don't line up under this model, right? They essentially sold low and bought high, if that makes sense. So that DOE quote said specifically, projects that are looking to come online between 2025 and 2028, those are the ones that have it the hardest based on this. Unfortunately for us, that's most of the projects that were contracted in the US. So that being said, what is the solution, right? What can these projects do? What can be done to regain financial viability, get to a place where, because I mean, you know, something to understand here is, like, this is not a matter of projects making more money or making less money. This is a case of these projects going to the banks and being like, hey, we need financing to build these projects. The banks are going to look at this and say, no, like, the numbers don't line up. So essentially what can be done to correct that? And what you've probably seen a lot in the news recently is most of these projects are doing what is known as PPA termination and rebidding, or PPA renegotiation, if you're lucky. Unfortunately, about 55% of all offshore wind contracts in the US landed right in the middle of this perfect storm of bad timing with these crazy, unpredictable economic challenges. But luckily for us, I mean, there is a path forward. There is a solution to this, right? It's not a fun one, right? So terminating your contracts is not what any of these developers ever wanted to do. It's, you know, you work really hard to get these contracts in place, and it takes a matter of years. And and you know, with terminations, you usually have to pay a fee. So SouthCoast Wind had to pay $60 million to terminate our contracts. And you know, pretty much all of these developers will have to pay similar fees. So it sucks, but it is the only path forward, because by terminating and rebidding, you're essentially hitting the reset button, and you can now adjust your power purchase agreements so that they make sense, right? You can adjust your power purchase agreements so that they actually reflect the cost of goods and services in this new climate, right? Cool. Any questions so far?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go for it.
If you're building a gas power plant, you're not, at least my understanding is, you're not signing a PPA, you're just selling into the grid at the price that the grid, you know, so.
Exactly, yeah.
So how far are we from a model for wind and I guess for solar as well, where you don't need the buffer of a 20-year PPA in order to be financially viable. I mean, presumably that day is coming, but I'm curious what the industry thinks.
Yeah, it's a good question, right? And you highlighted something really important there. The reason that this issue is kind of unique to renewables, or at least offshore wind, and I think a fair amount of renewables, is that offshore wind has a fixed price, right? So if it's, 17 cents a kilowatt hour today, it'll be 17 cents a kilowatt hour 20 years from now, because that's what the contract is. Oil and gas prices fluctuate like crazy. I mean, you see your bills in the winter versus your bills in the summer. It's because those are not fixed prices. What is the mechanism for addressing that and making it a little more predictable? That's a good question, and I'll touch on this a little bit in the what is good going on recently. Is that these new solicitations that are coming out in the modern era, this new economic climate that we live in, include inflation adjustment mechanisms, right? So that if something crazy like COVID or Ukraine happens again, you won't be in the same kind of trouble, that there are mechanisms built in there to allow for, a little bit of give and take within the PPA. I don't know if that gets at what your question is.
That's
good enough for now.
It doesn't get at it, but I'm happy to ask.
Okay, yeah.
Well, just to follow up, if there's like a 22 cents or whatever 20-year PPA, was that not inflation adjusted? So like 20 years from now, it would still be 22 cents, even if there was 100% inflation over 20 years. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it's tough to come up with the number. Yeah, exactly. Right? And that's kind of like one of the benefits, right? Is like inflation's kind of inevitable one way or the other, just not at that rate that just happened in the last couple of years. But yeah, it's kind of like one of the selling points of renewable energy is like, you buy it now and you're paying that same rate 20 years down the line, which is the case for almost nothing except like Costco hot dogs, right? I mean, there's pretty much nothing that costs what it did 20 years ago. Cool. So with that, that was kind of the economic headwinds, right? I'll quickly touch on the permitting headwinds, and I'm definitely over time, so I can kind of quickly. Cool. I'll move pretty quickly. So permitting is a huge conversation. For that reason, I'll just focus on Rhode Island permitting challenges right now, and they directly tie back to what's going on with these PPA terminations. So essentially what's going on in Rhode Island right now is two of the key regulatory agencies involved in the offshore wind permitting process. It's the Energy Facility Siting Board and the Coastal Resource Management Council, essentially have said they will not review any permits for any projects that don't currently have PPAs. So for the case for SouthCoast Wind, we had permits before these agencies. They were reviewing our permits, and the second we canceled our PPAs, they said, nope, pencils down, it's not worth our time, right? So the EFSB kind of started this wave by saying, there's certain needs, that need to be met by a given project, or you need to demonstrate need of a given project in order for us to review it. They said, without a PPA, there's no need. We argue the need is climate change. There's a million and one needs. The need is, reliable, renewable energy. And the reason this is kind of scary that the Energy Facility Siting Board and the Coastal Resource Management Council are doing this is because it's totally unprecedented. Never before have these two agencies equated having a PPA with a need for a project. And it's also just never been seen to my knowledge in any other state. So for example, we need permits from the Energy Facility Siting Board in Rhode Island and in Massachusetts. Not a single one of our Massachusetts permits is paused right now. They're all under review, including at the EFSB in Massachusetts. So it really is just these two agencies in Rhode Island that are, kind of choosing to approach it this way. And unfortunately, it's in direct contrast with the state's climate timelines. It's in direct contrast with calls from Governor McKee to say, we need to expedite the offshore wind permitting process and not delay it. And these delays have the potential to be really impactful. I mean, they could delay projects by years, potentially. There is not a super clear timeline to acquire a PPA. It's not something that happens on a regular basis. It's whenever the state decides to make one available. And unfortunately, it also has ripple effects that could very well cascade into other renewable areas as well, because all renewable projects of commercial scale require PPAs. So for any one of those projects, they could just say, no, you don't have a PPA. We don't have time to review your project. And unfortunately, that's just, it's inefficient. I mean, you really do need permitting, siting, and power sales to all kind of work in conjunction. That's probably my 3 minutes. Yeah. All right. Well, cool. I'll just summarize some really good points, just to kind of end things. There is a lot of hope. I mean, I work 8, 9, 10, 12-hour days on this every single day because there is quite literally nothing that gives me hope in the face of climate change like offshore wind. And I mean that with my whole heart. I mean, it is quite literally just the largest resource that we have at our disposal for the largest issue that we've ever faced as a society. And there's a lot of momentum behind it. There's a lot to like, now is the time to really kind of get involved and be a part of the conversation, because your voices really matter, and frequently these discussions are pretty unbalanced. But things are happening. Construction's underway. There's 2 projects being built right now, SouthCoast Wind and Vineyard Wind, and that's going to represent a 2,000% increase in the amount of offshore wind that we have in this country. That's 1 year. New York just last month had the biggest offshore wind procurement, the largest PPAs that have ever been had in the state. Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut are all having solicitations due in January. So again, that's like the most actionable path forward for these projects that had to cancel their PPAs. There's a path forward to getting new ones. $17 billion have been invested in offshore wind in the last 10 years. And those are not just by developers, that's new factories, that's, you know, academia and unions establishing training programs, that's port investments. Yeah, there's a lot to be excited about. The headlines, you know, I try to jump on the scariest way to deliver the message, and they want you to think like that a PPA termination is equivalent to, oh, these developers are giving up, they're walking away, it's over. But that's quite literally not it at all. I mean, pretty much every one of the projects that has pursued termination, with the exception of one in New Jersey, is planning to rebid and hit the ground running as quick as possible. So yeah, I know that was a lot, and I definitely went over time, but I'm more than happy to take any questions. And it is my job to answer questions for a living. So even if you don't get into them tonight, I'm super available.
We already have a quick question or two, but and then we'll just.
Yeah, that's perfect.
I do. A short one and then a long one. Are you willing to make your slides available
Yeah,
to
most
all of
definitely.
us
Yep.
Afterwards?
Yes, absolutely. And I even skipped a couple, so it's a
How
good
would we
surprise for
find
later.
them? How would we find them?
We can
All right.
make a link and send it to you.
Yeah,
Alright.
sure. And I'm happy to send you directly too, if that's helpful.
I don't know if this is too detailed for right now, but the IRA has tax credits
Yep.
for projects.
Yes.
And it's my understanding that some tax credits are limited to a requirement to use domestic content in the projects, and also to make the projects into disadvantaged communities.
Yes. Yep.
Is that a big problem? Those limitations?
Not
And
necessarily.
is it,
So
are those really like hard and fast rules?
yeah, that's a good question.
Domestic content.
That's a good question. So honestly, in my experience, a lot of the domestic content requirements are being driven by the state more so than the federal government. I know with the IRA tax credits are like one of the single most valuable resources in actually getting these projects off the ground. And some of these projects have had trouble accessing these tax credits. So just last month, 9 governors, include, I think it was like Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, Maine, you know, a whole slew of governors actually wrote a letter to Biden identifying a lot of these economic headwinds that we just talked about. And one of the main actionable items that they were calling for was to make these IRA tax credits more accessible. So I know that only answered part of your question, but yeah, you're on the right track there. It definitely is an important mechanism.
For sure.
Just briefly, this is Stephen Porder. He is at Brown. He's the Associate Provost of Sustainability in the Acacia. That's right. Ecology, evolution, and organizational biology. I guess it's all right there.
Yeah, you know, it's a super long time. Don't worry about it.
Okay, and he's written a lot and done a lot.
There you go. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so my name is Stephen Porder. I'm a professor at Brown in the ecology department, also in the Institute for Environment and Society. I teach about climate solutions. My fundamental research was mostly on tropical rainforests and tropical agriculture and global biogeochemistry. I did that for 15 years or so. I then in 2016 or 17 started working on institutional decarbonization for Brown, and they created this position which didn't exist anywhere else in the Provost office to say, you know, sustainability is an institution-wide problem, both from the physical infrastructure and to the teaching and research mission. So we need someone in the Provost office with sort of visions for that. And I've been doing that for the last little while I also continue to do the professor stuff sometimes. So I've been involved in the decarbonization plan for Brown, which is rapid and progressing. I'm happy to talk about that at any time that you're interested. But as part of that, I obviously have developed an interest in where we're going to get our renewable electricity, because we can electrify, but we can't decarbonize without a grid that is carbon free. And so I've become more and more involved in the offshore wind. So I was asked to come talk a little bit about some myths about offshore wind to help you all think about your communication. And I'll do that, and I'll be happy, obviously, to do whatever you all think is interesting, since it's all for you. So let me just, okay, so here's an outline for the talk. I want to just level set. I know that you know all of this, but sometimes it's helpful to just level set. So I'm just going to walk through very quickly a couple of graphics that I use when I'm talking to public audiences about climate change that really help drive this home in a way. And maybe that will help you in your conversations moving forward. Maybe it won't, it'll be fast. I'll talk about why offshore wind, and the bottom line is that most of global emissions come from energy. And so warming won't stop until we electrify everything, and then we get our electricity from emissions-free sources. So that is the path to solving climate change from the fossil perspective. Deforestation, agriculture are a different thing. Happy to talk about that at a different time. It's only 25% of the problem. We don't know the answers. We know the answers for the electricity grid and the rest of our energy supply, and that's an implementation problem. So I'm focused on the implementation problem. We'll figure out the last 25% over the next several decades as we decarbonize the rest of everything else. If we electrify everything, we will more than double our electricity demand. And I'll show you some data from that, but that means that the heating in this building can't come from burning stuff. It has to come from electricity. It means your car can't run on gasoline. It has to come from electricity. If you do all that stuff, you're going to double the amount of electricity you need. So not only do we need emissions-free electricity, given what we have demand today, but we need twice as much, roughly speaking, as we currently have online. So we need a massive build out of electrical infrastructure at the same time as we need a massive build out of renewable sources, or at least carbon-free sources. You can argue about nuclear if you want. So we need to build out renewable resources fast as we can. So this is like 5 minutes. I'm going to go through all those things in 5 minutes, maybe 6. And then we'll talk about some myths. Okay? All right, let's jump in. So these are 2 videos that I use when I'm talking to public, every public talk. You may have seen it. If you haven't, I want to walk you through it. So what you're seeing is a map of the world. And that map of the world is color-coded by the temperature of a place in the year 1880 to 1884, relative to the temperature in that place in the middle of the 20th century. So what do I mean by that? Western Africa, which you see in a hot color, was about 1 degree Celsius, maybe a little bit more, warmer in 1880 than it was in the middle of the 20th century. So in this 5-year block, it was this particular place that had a warm time. In contrast, Rhode Island was a little bit colder than it was in the middle of the 20th century. Okay, so each place is color-coded how warm it was relative to its 20th century average temperature. So some places were warm, like Western Africa. Some places were cold, like North America, like most of North America. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk now forward in time from the 1880s and watch the pattern. Okay. So you can see as we move through the 1880s and into the 1890s and into the 1900s, that there's an enormous amount of variation around the globe. Some places are warm, some places are cold, some places are really warm, some places are cold, right? Pick your favorite place and watch it. And then when you get into the 70s and 80s, I think you'll be able to see, even with a non-science background, you might be able to see that there's a change. This is climate change in a very real way and is very useful in 30 seconds for convincing people that this is not some local perturbation, or that the fact that it snowed last winter is somehow emblematic of it not being warming, right? So this is an average temperature. There is no way to heat up the entire surface of the planet without changing the Earth's energy balance. You can heat up one place and cool off another place, move heat around, but you can't heat up the whole system without having more heat trapped in the system. So I find this very useful for talking to audiences. The second thing I find very useful to talk to audiences that I would encourage you to also talk about when you're doing your advocacy is that the average temperature is not what we care about. So when you walk outside, if it's 80 or 81, you don't notice the difference, right? The New York Times had a really excellent graphic just a couple of weeks ago, where what they did is they took the temperature of the Northern Hemisphere in the summer. So these are summer temperatures from all across the Northern Hemisphere. And they said, okay, what's it look like? Well, there are some places that are cold, some times that are cold, and some places that are hot, and some times that are hot. And this is the average of all Northern Hemisphere temperatures between 1951 and 1980. And they said, what happened to the distribution of temperatures? And I just want you to keep your eye out on the extremely hot part. So what's happening here is a shift in the average. That's what the previous video showed you. And that looked very dramatic. But we don't experience the average. We don't like it when it's 100 degrees, right? We don't like it when we have an extra intense rainstorm. It doesn't matter what's really happening in the middle. And what you're seeing here, and this is a feature of climate change, not just for temperature, but for other things, is that as you shift the distribution, you get a huge shift in what we call the tail of the distribution, the end of the distribution. And it's those that are going to have impacts on people. So these two videos that I use, I find are very compelling when you're doing your advocacy, because they make it very visceral as to what is happening and what the effects will be on people as we move forward. Okay, and we're not exempt from this in Rhode Island, so this is just Rhode Island climate data, and the graph is showing you the average temperature trend, and the color stripes at the bottom are just showing you whether the year is hotter or colder relative to the mid-20th century average, and you can see the preponderance of hot years as we move forward in time on the bottom. Okay, so very quickly, because I know this is a short speed talk, this is an energy problem. This is a graph from our world of data just showing where emissions come from. The red is energy. If you look around the outside of the graph, you can pick your industries and all that stuff. We can get into the details if you're interested, but the bottom line is this is an energy supply problem, which is why offshore wind is a solution, because we need energy. And in Rhode Island, it's about the same. So this is from Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, and roughly if you add up our transportation, electricity, our heating, our commercial heating, our industry, we get most of our emissions coming from our energy supply in some way or another. One thing that the public also misses a lot is that warming is a result not of annual emissions, but of cumulative emissions. So this is a graph from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's showing you the amount of warming on the x-axis. The black is historical. The colored bands are projections into the future. And on the bottom, on the x-axis, is the total amount of carbon emissions from the start of the Industrial Revolution forward. It's a direct linear relationship. The more CO2 we put up, and other greenhouse gases, but let's just call it CO2 for now, the more CO2 we put up, the warmer we'll get. It is not a function of annual emissions. It is a function of cumulative emissions, which means going to 2050 and then dropping emissions to zero will have way more warming than dropping emissions now and tapering off to 2050, because it's the area under the curve that matters, not the endpoint. Right? It's the total amount that you emit. So if you keep emitting from now to 2050 and drop to zero, that's a lot more carbon than if you drop now and don't emit very much and taper down to zero, which is why Brown set a 75% reduction goal by 2025, in addition to a net zero goal by 2040. Okay, we have no real time left in the budget. We're going to blow past 1.5 degrees Celsius. Nobody in the scientific community thinks we're going to keep below that. The newspaper likes to keep saying that we will, but they're wrong. And electricity consumption will double. So this is just an example from my East Side house, pre-renovation and post-renovation, to give you a sense of the electricity demand. So this is my house over on the East Side. We moved in, we burned 866 gallons of oil a year, 600 gallons of gas. We used 3,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. It cost us $6,700. And we emitted 15 metric tons of CO2 from the system. We switched the house to a well-insulated house with an electric car and all heat pumps. So we don't burn any gas. Any oil, any gas. but our electricity consumption has gone from 3,000 to 13,000 because our vehicles and our home are now entirely running off electricity. Now, at the state level, you're not going to see a fourfold increase, right? But we're going to see a big increase in electricity demand associated with that. Just for completeness, it costs us half as much to run the house, and our emissions are down to 3. And that's before solar panels on the roof. So, but the point here that I really wanted to highlight is that we're going to double or more our electricity consumption. So we really need renewables quickly. Okay. I think that says it. The IPCC has listed off in their latest report, you can't read this, so I'll read it for you, listed off what is the most cost-effective and biggest potential for reducing emissions globally in energy, land use, buildings, transport, industry. These two top bars are wind and solar. And where it says blue, it's already cost competitive, and then the extra additions are not quite yet cost competitive. Right. So wind and solar are the two biggest options we have for decarbonization. Anyone who tells you different is not aware of any basic science. So that's leading us into that, the myth busting part. I'm just going to say that here in Rhode Island, I like this graph because it's just like, oh, it's just going to go up like linearly. So this graph here is Rhode Island baseload electricity on the black line on the top. And then the orange line is how we could get to the 2033 demand that we get 100% of our electricity from renewables. The blue bars are Revolution Wind and other long-term contracts that maybe, hopefully, will still be around. And then that red is the gap between. But I would argue the gap is much bigger than that because baseload is going to double. So that black line is going to go up again, right? They don't have the electrification of transport and heating in this projection. We need the electrification of transport and heating as well. You already saw this. We have great offshore wind here. And I would argue that it's really important to use our local resources for 2 reasons. One, this is a picture of the electricity grids in the United States. We are not connected to everybody else. So the fact that there's great wind in the Midwest, I mean, we are connected, but we're not connected in a big way. So the wind that we have in the Midwest is kind of useless to us. The solar we have in the Southwest is kind of useless to us. It can't really get here without a massive investment in a different kind of grid. But the wind that we have is right offshore. Not only that, storage, as you know, is a huge problem for renewables. And there is the potential to connect with Quebec, in theory at least, and pump hydro there. So the idea is when you have excess wind on the grid here, you can use that electricity to pump water up behind a dam in Quebec and then spill that water back down as a water battery. And Europe already does this. They pump water in Scandinavia when they have extra electricity on the grid. They use it to pump uphill in Scandinavia, and then that water comes back down over the dam. It's a way more efficient battery than a chemical battery. It's way less materials intensive. It doesn't work if you don't have the right topography. They have the right topography in Canada. If we could connect to that grid, it would really benefit both of us. Solar, not so much, because we're not connected. Okay, how am I doing, Frank? Can I do some myth busting? Okay, great. Okay, so I was trying to think about how to do this, and I look back at all of my talks that I give on climate change denial in general, and there's a lot of similarities with the myths that sort of swirl around offshore wind to those. So the first one is that wind energy doesn't decrease emissions. I don't actually understand how you could possibly think this, but the talks that I've heard from people who say this say things like, Germany has a lot of wind power and they have high emissions, or Texas has a lot of wind power and they have high emissions. And that's true. Texas does have the most wind power in the country. They also have an economy bigger than all of New England and way more coal, oil, and gas than all of New England as well. So their emissions, guess what, are higher than New England's. They're lower than they would be if they didn't have any wind power, but they're still higher than New England's because they're a bigger economy. So I don't really understand. Anyway, just to give you a sense, this is from the National Renewable Energy Lab. These are emissions of wind onshore and offshore, and the ones on the right are the fossil competitors. So do you have a question?
Would you say the ones on the right are what?
Fossil.
Oh,
So
okay.
gas, coal. Okay. So these are the published estimates, different ways of looking at the data. So these are both gas, these are both coal, 2 different ways of looking at the data. The black lines or the dark lines are the median estimates. These are the published and harmonized wind offshore and offshore wind numbers. So this on the y-axis is the greenhouse gas emissions.
So I think the Green Oceans people, pulled out some line from a report just, stating like, well, building wind turbines doesn't reduce emissions because it doesn't. It's only relative to the other means of getting
right.
energy.
If you leave everything else online, then it won't reduce emissions.
Right.
But, right.
The whole point
And the other argument that I've heard is that building wind turbines in Rhode Island won't fix climate change, which is of course true because climate change is global, but not building wind turbines in Rhode Island will make it impossible to fix climate change. We all need to build out carbon-free electricity sources everywhere. Rhode Island is as a small state, right? So even if we got all of our electricity from hamsters running in wheels, right, it wouldn't fix anything except we'd have some very fit hamsters, right? So of course it won't fix global climate change, but we have to decarbonize everywhere, and the resource that we have is offshore wind. It also, this argument doesn't get a lot of traction, but I like it. Like, Rhode Island has never had energy independence since the days that we cut down all the trees and burned them. We are dependent on a global network of oil and gas production that has all sorts of horrible inequity and environmental degradation globally and locally in regions all over the world, and we don't really suffer the consequences of that until climate change comes along. We have an opportunity to be energy independent. I don't understand why people don't think that's a good thing, but so far I haven't got a lot of traction. Anyway, so related myths. In the casing of some pieces of the wind turbines, there is a greenhouse gas called SF6, which is an extremely strong greenhouse gas. And it is true that it's extremely strong greenhouse gas, and it is true that if it leaks out, that would cause some climate change. But the life cycle analysis of wind is here. Even if it leaks out, it's still way better than coal and gas. So this falls under the category of true but irrelevant. Right? It's like saying, well, it's true but irrelevant. It doesn't change the greenhouse gas balance. That wind is way better than coal and gas. Would it be better if there was something else in there besides FS6? Yes, actually, it would be better. But it doesn't change the balance between the two things you're comparing, which is coal and gas versus wind. Okay. And I already talked about wind in Rhode Island won't solve climate change. Of course it won't. It's one small piece of the puzzle. It's a necessary but not sufficient kind of approach. Okay, this is another argument that was deployed against solar a lot. So what about all these wind turbines? Like, we're going to be swimming in garbage of like wind turbines everywhere, and like, what are these crazy aren't people environmentalists? So this was the same argument put up against solar panels. This is a paper I just pulled. It's from Waste Management. Wind turbine waste in 2050. You can see a big increase in wind turbine waste. And they say, 30 to 65 million tons by 2050. This is another common tactic of and the environmental movement is very guilty of this all the time, I have to say a big number to make it sound scary. This is going to cut down, 100 trees, 1 million trees. Well, how many trees, do you know how many trees there are in a forest? There are way more than 1 million trees in a forest. So before, everybody's guilty of this, in fairness. Okay, so let's put this in context. This is a paper from Nature Physics that just came out this year, which I really, really like. It's showing you between 2016 and 2050, the photovoltaic waste, solar waste, in these little orange cubes, okay? And on the left-hand side are things like municipal waste and coal ash, right, waste, and those boxes are scaled to size. We produce more coal ash waste in a month globally than we will produce in solar panel waste in the entire time between now and 2035. Okay, so where does wind fit into this? Well, that estimate is exactly almost the same. The 60 million tons is about the size of that little orange box. So will we have wind turbine waste? Absolutely. We produce a lot of waste. Is it as much as petroleum waste, which is oily sludge, or e-waste, or plastic waste, or coal ash waste, or municipal waste? No, it's not even it's not even close. And at the time, and what we're doing is getting clean energy from this. So are we going to have an impact on the world when we put up a whole bunch of wind turbines? Yes. Is the alternative a world free of human impacts? No, the alternative is a world run by coal and gas and oil. And those impacts are way bigger. So, related myths. We'll be left with a huge cleanup bill. Well, guess what we all pay for in Superfund all over the place? We pay to clean up the mess of mining companies and oil companies and coal companies and all sorts of other companies all the time. They go out of business, they leave us with cleanup. I have to say, I don't particularly trust wind turbine companies to pay for their cleanup either, no offense, but during the lifetime of the project, we will be getting clean electricity and fighting climate change. And if we're stuck with that bill, I'd rather be stuck with that bill than the oil spill bill, which we also get stuck with. I know, you'll clean up.
The federal government requires it. Before you can start construction, you need a bond.
I
that
know,
covers it.
but the federal government requires it for mining companies too, and they get out of it all the time. So, yeah, okay. So what about decommissioning? We just talked about that. And then another thing, this is a very common trope in mythologizing, is like, look at this bad thing over here, but don't look at this bad thing over here, right? So there's lots of garbage coming from wind turbines. Don't look at this garbage over here. It's like way more, right? So it's a very common distraction tactic. Okay, well, I run this radio show called Possibly on Rhode Island Public Radio, and we did an interview with a marine mammal biologist from Duke. This one's really super frustrating. So there's sort of a couple of reasons why there are whale deaths. One of them is actually that there are more whales. So whale populations are rebounding, and so we find more dead whales because there are more whales. This is what my whale biologist friends tell me. There aren't any wind turbines really going in. So like there can't be wind turbines killing whales in 2017 in New Jersey when there are no wind turbines in New Jersey. So this one is just sort of a utter myth.
But the whales are afraid of the wind turbines coming in the future.
Oh yeah, they're having heart attacks. They're stressed out. Yeah, I think that might be it. So you all know this. Audubon, all of the major organizations that study this stuff are basically really saying what is true, which is, and I'll read it for you if I can. Species journeying over the Atlantic Ocean will soon have to navigate wind turbines, but without clean energy, their futures are more imperiled, right? So I think it's totally valid that this is a big disturbance to the ocean, and it's going to affect marine mammals, and it's going to affect fishermen, and it's going to affect lots of things. And the counterfactual is not a pristine ocean that nothing has ever touched and that is perfect. The counterfactual is a warming ocean, warming faster here than almost anywhere in the world. Fish moving, whales moving, fish strikes all over the place. Like there's all sorts of threats. On net, marine mammals will almost certainly benefit from reducing global warming, much more than the damage that may well be done in some cases, but the real answer is we don't know, because all the big offshore wind in Europe doesn't have migratory whales in their fields. So we will find out. There's a lot of monitoring. All marine mammal and all bird people I know would rather put up wind turbines because they think it's going to fix climate change, and they'll take the risk. We are not in the privileged position of having pristine ecosystems that we have to worry about disturbing. We are in a crisis situation where we have to make choices about how to fix it. And so I'll just leave it at that for that one. The thing about phytoplankton, I don't even know how to talk. I mean, these are like microscopic photosynthetic organisms. I don't know how they would be affected by a wind turbine, but I've heard that. Windmills will hurt fisheries. Well, the jury is out on that. Some of them may well serve as marine reserves. Some of them may not. It's certainly true that fishermen will be affected by windmills. There's been a lot of negotiation about that. I don't think we do ourselves any benefit by pretending like that's not the case. But I don't think there's really any evidence that windmills will hurt marine life in general. Okay. So I'm just going to end in two seconds. Those are some of the common myths. I said I talked a lot about climate denial myths, and there's a lot of similarities in the general approach of the anti-offshore wind myths. The first one is to really highlight things that are true but irrelevant. Like, there was a dead whale on the beach in New Jersey. That is true, there was. It doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about. Another really common one is to cherry pick data. So Germany has a lot of solar panels, and then all of a sudden they had to turn on coal-fired power plants when the war in Ukraine happened.
Well, that's true because they were reliant on gas from Russia, and Russia turned off the gas, so they had to turn on their coal-fired power plants. And also they had shut down their nuclear power plants because of Fukushima. But if they had all solar and storage, they wouldn't have had to do anything. So, like, yes, they did have to turn on coal-fired power plants, but not because of renewables, not because of wind, but because they had shut down their nuclear plants and Russia shut their gas off, which they were reliant on. Okay. There is a massive difference between correlation and causation. Okay. The fact that Texas has lots of windmills and lots of emissions is true. Both of those things are true. They are not causative. Right? They have lots of emissions because they burn lots of coal and oil and gas, and they have lots of windmills because they built lots of windmills. But those are not one causing the other. Those are correlated. Right? I get older every year. It's not because the temperature is going up, but both things are happening every year. So be careful about correlation and causation. Humans really stink at correlation and causation. I can talk about evolutionarily why I think that is, if you're interested. Okay. And then I think this is really the main one. It is definitely true that windmills are going to kill some birds, and climate change is going to kill a lot more birds. And it is definitely true that windmills are going to generate some waste, and our other way of doing business is going to generate a lot more waste. So if you only point to the negative of something, it's very easy to think that you shouldn't do it. But we don't live in a world that's perfect, and then we're going to do something that has an effect. We live in a world where we have massive global, local, and regional environmental impacts with massive injustices. And we're trying to figure out a path away from that world into a better, but not yet perfect world. And that's sort of the key, I think, to understanding the myths that come. So I'll stop there, take any questions. Yeah.
Thank you. I just, it seems like in some ways, some of the focus of your presentation was on the difficulties of communicating about these issues. And I think for many CARI members, we end up being community liaisons where people ask us crazy questions. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions that I've been asked is, has to do with the potential impacts to marine life from offshore wind. And it's difficult to answer those questions when the answer is, well, there's no evidence that it's damaging, but like there's no, I think my question is, when there's no clear answer for someone who is responding to a form of energy that could kind of save us all in the short term, I don't really know how to communicate with folks who are motivated by fear when I don't have an answer for them that's other than, well, we don't have evidence that that's going to happen.
So I would say a couple of things. I would say specifically for whales, the number one and number two things that kill whales are ship strikes at speed and entanglement in fishing gear. And neither of those things are going to happen inside these wind farms because there aren't going to be a lot of fishermen there, mm-hmm. and there aren't going to be boats going really fast, right? So I think, unfortunately, we don't know. Like we and there are lots of regulations in place to make it less damaging, but we cannot promise that a whale will never die in a wind farm. Like that's just not. So I think that I share your concern. I would say I would answer that question by saying I know a lot of people who have spent their entire lives trying to protect marine mammals and who literally cry at whale biopsies. And they want wind turbines because even though they're not perfect, they are a solution to a problem that is way bigger than what the whales will face with the wind turbines. So even though we don't know, I care a lot about them. Like, and I do. I can't read. My colleague Bathsheba DeMuth wrote this beautiful book about whaling, in part about whaling in the Bering Strait. I couldn't read it because of the description of what of whaling. Like I can't go to the whaling museum in New Bedford. Like I can't do it. So I care a lot too. I would join them at that place if that's true for you. And say, but everyone I know who's a marine mammal expert who cares about these animals more than anyone else and have devoted their lives to it, they all want the wind turbines, not because they're perfect, but because they're better than the alternative. That's all I mean, I really would encourage you not to get out beyond the data and say, it's all gonna be fine. Because the truth is, until they're there, we have models and all models are wrong and some models are useful and we'll find out. But stay with telling the truth, I think. I mean, I'm not suggesting you're not, I'm just saying, you know, yeah.
So I have a friend who's grew up in Newport and is very connected with the fishing community. And he's pretty progressive, but he's freaking out about offshore wind. And he's saying, well, let's have a windmill on every rooftop, but why do we have to go out in the ocean and do it? And you know things are gonna go wrong out there, like the line that's coming in from the wind to the land is gonna get damaged, and then they're gonna have to fix it, or something's gonna go wrong, and it's.
You mean like every time it snows and the lines go down on land too? I mean,
right, because he's saying it's gonna, it's gonna be continual disturbance to that area, to the ocean, mess up the ocean.
Yeah.
Like, so I'm just trying to figure out how to talk to him.
Yeah, so I guess I would say a couple things. I would say, first of all, the resource, the amount of wind offshore is way more. So the winds are stronger, they're more consistent, you can build the things taller. I mean, we have an expert in the room, but all of those things make it a much bigger resource offshore than onshore. So that's number one. Number two, I think that SouthCoast Wind and everybody else who has shown maps has done a bit of a disservice by showing big dots where the wind turbines are in small areas. Because the truth is, if you're spacing them a mile apart, if you're
Not a mile, so like
1.2 or whatever, So if you're spacing them that far apart, they're actually like, their footprint is teeny compared to the amount of ocean that's there, right? Like they're on this foundation that's how big?
Good question.
Okay, so let's argue that the foundation is like a little bit bigger than this building in its footprint, right? And then there's 1.2 miles between that one and the next one, right? So the idea that the cable would have to be dug up and that would disturb the whole ocean. The ocean is a very big place. The cable is essentially a wire going from that wind farm to land. If you had to dig it up all the time, you'd still only be digging up a teeny little teeny little line. And the fishermen trawl all the time, so they dredge up the seafloor constantly. So I get it. Like, so here's where I'm sympathetic. It's going to affect fishermen. And when your way of life is being threatened by a change, I understand why you would argue against that. As a society, we often make decisions that don't benefit everyone. And I personally would argue, this is not a scientific opinion, that is why we have a social safety net. So that as the economy changes and people are hurt by that, that there's a safety net so that people can do other things, so that they don't lose their health care, so so that their livelihoods are preserved in some way. But I mean, it's a bad example in some ways and not in others, but like when things change, like telephone line repairmen are out of business because of cell phones, right? And that's unfortunate, and they're like, there should be a social safety net, but we didn't stop. We all switched to cell phones anyway. And I kind of feel that way. We're gonna need, this is the resource we have. But I wouldn't sugarcoat it. This is gonna affect fishermen. And some of them have already chosen to work with the offshore wind industry and, change their boats over to doing that. Others will make other decisions, and I want to ensure that they're safe. I want to ensure that the Coast Guard is able to rescue them, all those things. In fact, the 1.2 miles or the 1 nautical mile spacing is a huge concession on the part of the wind farm industry, because that's not an optimal spacing for a wind farm. If you're just harvesting energy, that's not how you would put them, but putting them in that grid was what the fishermen asked for.
It's the largest spacing anywhere in the world. And offshore wind goes back, 30 years at this point.
Yeah. And that was a concession to the fishermen. Now, we hosted on the radio show an hour-long like offshore wind and fisheries thing before the pandemic, and the fishermen were there, and I've been at the coastal resources meetings as well, and there's a few of them who get up and say, I've been a fisherman for 50 years and you're trying to put me out of business. And I don't think that we can afford to continue to burn gas because there are some fishermen whose business is going to be impacted by this. But I feel their pain.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna add that every offshore wind developer is also required to pay compensatory mitigation funds, right? So each one of these projects will be paying tens of millions of dollars to the local commercial fishing industry to kind of help offset any disruption to their services. Most of that occurs during construction, honestly, just because we have big boats in there. We don't want fishermen getting too close, but then like we were just talking about, once construction's done, I mean, the spacing is pretty substantial. And I mean, I recognize that some long lines, some drag nets are miles long, so maybe 1 nautical mile isn't sufficient, but that's not a huge percentage of what we see in the Northeast.
And I would also just add to that we don't know, to the point earlier, but there's good evidence in some places that the benefit from hard substrate in the ocean, which is a limiting resource, like the actual foundation of these turbines will provide habitat and fish nurseries, like in the way that coral reefs do. I think the relative balance of that and how much of an effect in terms of increased fish catch outside of the wind farm, that's definitely going to be spatially variable, and I wouldn't trust a particular model as to exactly, but there's at least a non-zero, and probably I would say there's a 50-50 chance that the fishermen will actually do better because there's more fish. But I don't think that anyone could say that with any more certainty than a coin toss. That's my own personal.
And as you said, I mean, climate change is gonna.
Well, they're already catching way different fish than they did 20 years ago because the fish are all moving. And if you look in the Gulf of Maine, it's the same. The Gulf of Maine is the fastest warming piece of ocean in the world. So, yeah.
I'm also from Jamestown, so I hear a lot about fishing.
Sure.
And a lot about Cox's Ledge.
Yep.
And a lot of people are freaking out about seeing all the the construction ships that are sitting there in outside of Newport Harbor. I'm just wondering if there's any data or any study that's been done that looks at the potential damages that we might see from wind versus the already happening damages that we're having from burning fossil fuels. Because I feel like that would be a really good comparison, a really good visual for people to understand, like, yes, we are going to have some, implications of putting offshore wind in. However, comparatively, it's not even.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. So it's a tricky one because the damages from climate change are global. And they're caused by the global emissions. And the damages from offshore wind, such as they are, will be local, right? Like people are going to see the wind turbine. But having worked in tropical rainforests that have been devastated by our appetite for gold and our appetite for lumber and our appetite for oil, and seeing the incredible devastation of the world's most biodiverse regions and millions of indigenous and non-indigenous people throughout the tropics and throughout other places where oil extraction happens. I am sympathetic to the argument of people in Jamestown, but only we are so blessed that we don't have any of this stuff here. So we don't see the extractive industry that is crisscrossing the globe and destroying way bigger areas than Rhode Island, right? In the search for these fossil resources. And so for the first time since we cut down all our trees to heat our houses and to build ships, for the first time we were being forced to reckon with our own energy footprint and to say, oh, you know what, it's not free. Like we've been offshoring these effects to everybody else. And so I am sympathetic. Look, I have a place in very, very rural Canada off the grid. And if somebody came to me and said, I want to put up 100 wind turbines on the ridge that you've looked at since you were born and seen nothing but trees and lake, right? It would really bum me out. Like I'd be very upset about it, but I would feel like I had to accept it because the truth is that lake is way warmer than it used to be. There's no like,
no. And I'm 100% in agreement. I have absolutely, I'm 100 pro offshore wind for sure. I again get the same sort of arguments from people like, oh, it's going to be destroying, our offshore environment, and
Yeah, it's not.
it's like, well, the global sea temperature
Right.
rising and different migration patterns of fish, that's also affecting, going to affect the fisheries
So
dramatically.
Yeah, I think the
know?
economic cost of climate change relative to the economic cost of like fishermen not being able to catch their fish, I don't know that study has been done for Rhode Island in particular, but the study of what it will cost us to adapt to climate change versus what it will cost to fix it before it happens too much, right? That study has been done, and those numbers are, ounce of prevention, pound of cure kind of thing.
Mhm.
Like but it's at the global scale.
Yeah.
Timmins Roberts might know better if someone's taking this on as a little class project or something for Rhode Island, but I'm not aware of it. It's a good idea though, actually. So now I'm thinking about it. We should do it.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then we're over time, so we gotta.
Okay. Sorry.
No,
Whoever.
You can go ahead.
What I was gonna ask, you kind of alluded to this point, you didn't touch on it in a lot of detail on like a myth or issue with wind and really mostly solar and other renewables, but the intermittency issue, right? And the potential that, a lot of renewable energy isn't gonna be 24/7 operating. You touched a little bit on it with your comment on the pumping of water, right? I work in the renewable fuels part of X industry, and so I'm curious if Rhode Island is looking much into other forms of energy storage, being hydrogen. Obviously, battery storage is a really popular one. Just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So storage is the $1 trillion problem, right? We can build windmills. It's really just a question of arguing about where we're going to put them. They'll get cheaper. We'll have floating windmills in the next decade or two, like whatever. But storage is going to be key, because without good transmission networks and a mix of wind and solar, we're going to need storage. I'll say a couple things. I'm not super worried about the daily storage demand, because I think that batteries, and I think non-lithium batteries like sodium or maybe iron air, or maybe, there's a Rhode Island company called Ambry that's doing liquid metal batteries that are really, so like there's a lot of technology that's not going to rely on very rare earth elements and all that stuff for daily storage. Seasonal storage is a much bigger challenge, right? If you have a lot of production, so our peak electricity demand right now is on hot summer afternoons when everybody's turning on their air conditioning, right? And it's 100 degrees outside. But very soon our peak electricity demand, I hope, is cold winter nights when everybody's heat pumps are running and their cars are plugged in, right? And there are no furnaces anymore. And so on cold winter nights, we have a lot of offshore wind and we have zero solar, right? So how are we going to do that? Well, what Brown is doing is actually, we just drilled our first 3 geothermal test wells. And the idea is that if you have, and we're in this idea here as well, like we drilled one in downtown. The idea is that if you have extra heat, either from your air conditioners in the summer or your refrigeration units in this building right now, you take that heat and you inject it underground and you heat up the rock, and then you pull that heat back up when you need it. And so I think for urban environments, I think geothermal heat storage is going to be really critical. I think for grid stability, the combination of batteries and cars will work itself into grid storage in the next 15, 20 years. And I think honestly, we don't know what the full answer to that question is. I'm very skeptical of hydrogen. I'm very skeptical of hydrogen, but I'm not against it if it can be shown to be as good as it could be. Other people are looking into ammonia as a potential combustion source. I think there's some advantages to that as well. I think we're not yet at the spot in Rhode Island where we're ever going to need to curtail wind. Not yet. And when we get to that spot, when we have too much wind on the grid and we desperately need storage, I'll be happy to worry about that problem. I will also say that like at Brown, we're already thinking about how to integrate. So we have 240 acres of solar panels in southern Rhode Island that is just now being interconnected to the grid after 5 years of ridiculousness about, interconnection and all the same stuff with wind. But more annoying because it was me. But anyway, we're already thinking about how we're gonna integrate battery storage and, you know, and all of that trade-off. So do I think I have 100% of the answer? No. Am I worried about it? No, because I think we'll get there.
Thank you.